an award-winning screenwriter, director, and academic whose work crosses boundaries between new media, film, and theater. He wrote and directed Lincoln in the Bardo, a VR experience for New York Times VR based on the acclaimed best-selling novel by MacArthur genius George Saunders, which was shortlisted for an Interactive Emmy Award and praised as one of the top 5 must-see virtual reality experiences by Time magazine. He was also the lead creator of Objects in Mirror, AR Closer Than They Appear, an augmented reality and immersive theater installation based on the object lesson that premiered at Tribeca Storyscapes 2018 and transferred to the New York Theater Workshop. Through a series of case studies based on recent projects, this talk will examine the unique opportunities and challenges for narrative fictional storytelling in virtual and augmented reality. Thanks for being here, Graham.
My pleasure. I've been hearing about this place for quite some time, so it's really an honor to be here. And I'm very happy to spend time with you over the course of this lunch hour and a half. So my background, normally I kind of leave my academic affiliation out of this because I'm usually just speaking about things in a pure sort of art and entertainment context. I have another half of my life where I'm also finishing a doctorate at Columbia in digital humanities, where my work is focused on kind of computational approaches to narrative on the analytical side. So it's sort of nice to be speaking in an academic environment where actually both of these things are somewhat relevant. I'll mostly be talking about the creative end of things today. But so sort of my own background coming into this was very hybrid. I grew up acting professionally in New York. As a kid, I was on Broadway. The whole time I was growing up, I transitioned into writing and directing for film probably about like 8 or 9 years ago, and then I sort of fell into working in virtual reality, and then along for the ride into other immersive technologies a few years back, largely through the first major project I did in the space, which was Lincoln in the Bardo. I guess the way that I was going to approach this today was sort of in terms of war stories, but then kind of abstracting out a little bit. I'm going to talk about 4 projects over the course of today. Lincoln in the Bardo, which is a sort of a kind of standalone 10-minute long VR short film that came out through the New York Times, and was really sort of came out at a moment where, and I think some of these questions have begun to resolve themselves, but at that point in like late 2015, early 2016, there was a lot of question just around the possibility of narrative storytelling at all in virtual reality. People coming over from the film side who were very nervous about what would it mean to remove frame, would people be able to follow a storyline if they could look wherever they wanted, right? Those were a lot of the early questions. I'll talk about this VR episodic series that I did, the interpretation of dreams, which was based on Freud's original case studies in dream interpretation that came out through Samsung as part of their VR pilot season. Was sort of this experiment with sort of the next phase of questions, which is like, okay, well, you can do story in virtual reality. Can you do complex serialized storytelling across multiple episodes? How do you do that? What are the complexities of doing that? Then I'll be talking about a theatrical kind of augmented reality adaptation that I did called Objects in Mirror Closer Than They Appear. That was an experiment in basically taking one kind of a theater format and merging it with augmented reality, and also playing with more kind of branching or non-narrative techniques. So how can people navigate a space and still feel like they have a story, but in an open-ended format? And finally, a kind of experiment in VR feature filmmaking, which was a piece, Hamlet 360 by Father's Spirit, which came out a couple of months back through Google and WGBH. And if time permits, I'll kind of abstract out a little bit from those case studies and talk a little bit about, I think, principles for narrative storytelling. So to launch into it, so Lincoln in the Bardo was, this piece came, how many people have heard of this piece before? Great. Did you hear about it because of this talk, or you heard about it through some other means? So this piece is based on a novel by George Saunders. How many people know who George Saunders is? George is well known primarily as a short story writer. So he's published 9 short story collections and now 1 novel. You might have seen his work in Harper's or The New Yorker. His short stories tend to have a weird kind of a sort of absurdist comic, but a kind of paranoid tone to them. It's hard to describe and very hard to adapt. A lot of the short stories have a kind of techno-dystopic element to them. So I kind of came to his work originally through a short story that I absolutely fell in love with, called John, which is about children who have these units installed in the back of their heads that project commercials directly into their field of view. So it actually was a short story about augmented reality probably 15 years before anyone had used the term augmented reality. And I read the short story and I was interested in adapting it into a film, and that was kind of how we came into contact, and it grew into this project. But anyway, so George's novel, Lincoln and the Bardo, came out in February of 2016. It won the Man Booker Prize. You may have read about it at the time because it was the second book by an American author that won the Man Booker Prize 2 years in a row, and there was some uproar about that. It was a #1 New York Times bestseller. And the piece came out through NYT VR. How many people have used the app, NYT VR? So up to that point, it had been used exclusively for documentary content and immersive journalism. So this was also kind of a first experiment in the New York Times releasing fiction through the app. And again, this was at a moment in 2016 where it was sort of unclear how narrative storytelling might work in that format. So the New York Times was excited about releasing its first major fiction piece. This was also the first time that a novel had ever been adapted into virtual reality. So there was a bunch of kind of interesting legal implications of doing that, which I will talk about in terms of how rights work in terms of book adaptation. And this piece is still up on the New York Times app, if you're interested in checking it out. So this is just a trailer to kind of orient you a little bit.
Father will come to collect me.
He might come, but I doubt he will collect you.
And even if he should come, he will not stay long.
All the while wishing himself elsewhere.
Thinking only of lunch.
Father! Father!
Is this wrong? Unholy.
Father!
So the piece is about, it's set over the course of one night in a cemetery, the night after Abraham Lincoln's son Willie, a 10-year-old boy, has died of typhus. It's set in 1862, so it's the very kind of early stages of the Civil War before the Union has fully committed military troops. So kind of the crux of the novel, in a sense, is Lincoln making this decision to commit other people's sons to die in war at the moment when he has lost his own son. It's set entirely in a cemetery over the course of the night and narrated kind of Greek chorus style by this collection of dead souls who are living in a kind of limbo state, unwilling to move on to the next world. So the bulk of the characters are supernatural. And then there's this kind of poignant effort by a living father, the president, to somehow connect emotionally with the soul of his dead son across this chasm of death. the way that this project began, I was, as I mentioned, I was sort of obsessed with George's work, and I was interested in adapting it to film. And I met up with him in a bookstore in Austin, Texas, just as I was starting to play around with the technology. I put him in a headset, and then a few weeks later, I got a call from Penguin Random House saying, hey, would you be interested in coming in and speaking to us about what it might mean to adapt some of his work into virtual reality? And I went in with like this laundry list of short stories, notably the one that I mentioned to you, that I was interested in adapting over. And they said, rather than doing something with the older work, what if you did something like, a virtual reality book trailer or something, right? And so the conversation actually started in and around that. And first I said, let me read the book and see if it makes sense to adapt this into virtual reality at all. And I read it, I was deeply moved by it, but alongside of that, I thought it had a number of characteristics that made a lot of sense in terms of adaptation into virtual reality. So the first aspect of it was there was this very strong sense of place, all of it set within this cemetery at night. So it's like, okay, I can do transportative location. Second, it was narrated by this Greek chorus of dead souls. And so there were opportunities because of sort of the size of the cast to do a lot of immersive staging around the viewer. The characters were supernatural, so there was an opportunity to do a lot of visual effects work that I thought would be kind of visually stunning in virtual reality. And lastly, it presented this wonderful problem of can you do something that is very poignant and subtle in this medium, which was really not something I had seen anyone do up to that point, and what I was excited about trying to figure out. It was also totally terrifying, because that is the emotional keystone of the book. So if you read the novel, it really emotionally hinges around this moment where Lincoln and his dead son contact each other. And it was what inspired the work to begin with. I said yes to doing it, and then what I said was I don't think a trailer format is the right thing to do here. I'd really like to do something that expands to the level of, at minimum, sort of short film length. And so we went out in search of partners, and we sort of thankfully hit this wonderful moment with NYT VR, where they were excited about doing something in a fiction format. They knew George's work from 10th of December, which he had won a MacArthur Genius Grant for afterwards. And so they agreed to fund and distribute the piece, and so it expanded into this much larger project that I spent sort of the better part of 9 months on. It was a pretty big team involved. Some of you may know the guys from Sensorium, Matt Niederhauser and John Fitzgerald, who spent a bunch of time over at the Media Lab. We were working with NYT VR, Penguin Random House, The Molecule. I cannot recommend them enough. They did the visual effects that you saw. Silver Sound did the spatialized audio. And then otherwise, a lot of this process looked like shooting an independent film, right? So we had a very large cast of cast and crew in terms of set designers, light design, et cetera. The book, to begin with, sort of lent itself well to adaptation as well, because it's written in this sort of almost semi-dramatic literature format. So a lot of it relies on kind of these long monologues that characters deliver, and then figuring out how to kind of translate that spatially. We went through an extensive design process in terms of the visual aesthetic of the characters, and then at this point, again, very little had been done in terms of laying out narrative spatially. So we did an extensive workshop process where I just tried building this thing multiple times very, very cheaply. And part of the reason for doing that, come back to this. Part of the reason for doing that was because in order to shoot this thing, and this is some of the photography from on set, this was all shot in Greenwood Cemetery, most of the shooting was done on green screen. So green screen is difficult to work with in 2D filmmaking. It's substantially more complicated to work with in virtual reality. Has anyone done work with green screen in virtual reality? Yeah? Okay. So one of the issues that you run into, what we were trying to build essentially was ultimately this kind of crowd scene, right? So the way that the piece feels is a little bit like a 10-minute play unfolding with heavy visual effects. There are no obvious cuts over the course of it. but there are something like 400 separate pieces of video that are overlaid over the course of the piece in order to create that illusion with no obvious scene cuts, right? And the other kind of complexity here is for large sections of this piece, you have a crowd of souls, and then the camera position, everyone is focused essentially on the same vantage points. So what we were doing with green screen was trying to sort of build piecemeal this gigantic crowd with everyone having the same focal point, right? So doing that requires matching all of these sight lines across dozens of different characters, and then overlaying that on top of the physical geography of the cemetery. So actually, in order to do that, I brought in an architect to completely site map this section of Greenwood Cemetery that we were using, and then we kind of rebuilt large sections of it on green screen and then went sort of piece by piece down the line. Again, the other complexity of doing this in virtual reality is you tend not to be able to cut into performances, right? There's no way the video tends to get fairly jittery, right, if you're trying to cut into performances at separate points in time. So not only did we need to physically position everyone in space, we also needed performances to line up perfectly in time, because you cannot piece them together after the fact the way that you could if you were doing 2D filmmaking with green screen. So what we needed to do was, one, time everything out and then run this thing piece by piece across dozens of different characters in order to reconstruct this crowd at the end. And ultimately it sort of became this, this type of image. The other thing that was interesting about the piece is this issue around rights. So one of the first issues that we hit, because this was the first time that a novel was adapted into virtual reality, how do you define book adaptation to virtual reality rights in a way that does not intersect with adaptation of a book into film rights? And this was the first time that a contract like that was written. So we actually went through a pretty extensive negotiation process that literally just involved lawyers for the first time sitting down and trying to define how does a virtual reality film differ from a standard feature film? How do we know that 10 to 15 years down the line, if we are signing over virtual reality adaptation rights, that we have not in effect signed over traditional cinema rights if these two media ultimately converge, right? Because you tend to be buying rights, for extended periods of time. This work was going up through the New York Times. The New York Times permanently archives material, right? So in order to make a piece like that, you need rights that sort of exist ad infinitum. And if you're signing over rights ad infinitum, you are potentially signing over film rights ad infinitum, right? So there's a really extensive legal process as well around doing this for the first time. So the piece came out through NYT VR. We were shortlisted for an interactive Emmy. And then that led to a series of other projects, which I'll go through now. And then we actually toured this as well with George's book tour around the country and through Europe. It's me with George. Okay, the next project.
Just how long is that project?
How long was the piece?
How long is the VR piece for?
The piece is 10 minutes long. And it took, I would say, soup to nuts, about 9 months to make. It's about 3 months of pre-production and design, about 2 weeks of shooting, and then about 3 months of post-process, reassembling all these pieces from green screen and whatnot.
Is there a budget to be revealed as well?
I can't do that. Offline, let's check. Okay, so next, very different piece. Objects in Mirror Closer Than Appear. This appeared at Tribeca Storyscapes last year. The way that this piece started, and it was an immersive installation that looked kind of like an abstract storage unit or a section of your garage if it were enormously expanded, that users navigated with augmented reality technology disguised as 19th century stereoscopes or other objects from around the house. I'll show you more images of that. So this piece started off, I'd been interested for a long time in how these kinds of immersive, so the other thing I should add about Lincoln and the Bardo, all of those actors were theater actors that I cast in it, and a lot of the sort of aesthetic of the piece is a kind of theatricalized aesthetic. I've tended to be very interested in kind of how to represent the surreal in virtual reality, in part because I think the heightened aesthetic lends itself well to the medium. And a lot of what I was doing there was sort of translating aspects of theatrical vocabulary into virtual reality. And then this piece kind of grew out of a desire to go the other way. So what might it mean to begin to take some of this technology and sort of insert it back into a theatrical context? So the way that this started off was I reached out to New York Theater Workshop, which is kind of a pillar of downtown experimental theater in New York. It's been around for 40 years. And I said, I'm interested in looking for, I'm interested in finding projects where we can begin to intersect new technology with kind of traditional theatrical vocabulary. And that began as a collaboration with Jeff Sobel, who designed this one-man show and performs this one-man show called The Object Lesson. So it's hard to describe, so I'll show you a little bit of video from it. So this is from the theatrical production. So the audience would sort of walk in at the beginning into this gigantic space that's just filled with boxes and cultural detritus, no instructions, and they just start opening up boxes, looking at things. They're left for maybe 15 minutes at the beginning of the show, just to kind of sift through what feels like someone else's basement. A lot of the objects are humorous. Some of the boxes feel realistic. Some of them are sort of absurd. A box that's labeled snake and bagel, and you open it up and it's a coiled snake that looks like a bagel. There's a lot of kind of humor, indie aesthetic, etc. And then as the show sort of advances, Jeff begins to construct the set out of objects that he's pulling out of these boxes. You can see that people, there's no traditional seating at all in the theater. People are just sitting on boxes or chairs that happen to be lying around in the space. They can reposition dynamically over the course of the show. And then as the show advances, a lot of it kind of relies on Jeff pulling things out of different boxes. I'll show you kind of a sort of a humorous segment later on. There's a lot of audience participation. There's a point in the show where audience members are invited to begin taking objects out of their. I think these are two people who are taking objects out of their bags and slowly reciting the entire contents of their purses. And then, sort of as the show advances, large sections of it basically involve kind of these riffs with Jeff slowly pulling objects out of boxes and then telling a story that spins around them. This is a wild section of the show where he pulls out, several hundred items out of a box that looks no larger than that. It's all done through sort of magic tricks in order to make this box look like it's bottomless. So one of the big questions in doing this piece became sort of how do you translate this kind of immersive theater form into something that you could do in first in virtual reality. So where this piece started was we did a 7-minute long virtual reality experience that was based on the show. And sort of the first question was, okay, what can you do that one would be impossible in theater but is possible in virtual reality? And that somehow remains thematically true to the essence of the show. And so, to me, this show is based on sort of a triangular relationship between Jeff as a performer, the objects, and the audience, right? And the audience has a relationship to objects, as you saw at the beginning. They're kind of playing around with stuff. They have a relationship to Jeff, and Jeff has a relationship to these things, right? And so the premise behind the VR piece became, well, what if we collapse the relationship between the audience and the objects? We literally put the audience in the perspective of the objects, right? That's a perspective that is only possible in virtual reality, but also is sort of thematically essential to work and to Jeff's work. And so what that became was this piece called Subject Object, where you as a viewer here, I'll just sort of fast forward to sort of some of the funner sections of this.
What was the other piece called that you did?
So the original show was called The Object Lesson.
Okay.
And then this piece was called Subject Object, where you know, as a subject are placed in the perspective of objects. So here's sort of a little example scene. So.
Oh my God, you're here! Oh, welcome. This is the place. Do you drink wine? You want a glass of wine? This is a really nice bottle of wine. Yeah, I just got.
So this piece was sort of constructed through this sequence of kind of vignettes, right, in which there's a storyline, but similar to the aesthetic of the original show. It was meant to be open-ended, have a fairly fanciful and absurdist sense of humor, and in the same way that the show feels a little bit like it's held together by duct tape and bubble gum, we were going for kind of a similar feeling. And then I wanted to go a step further than that. So now we had this show that relies on an immersive set and then a bunch of digital assets that we had created that were kind of linked to objects. And so my interest at that point was, okay, how do we extend this a step further and actually merge these two things together? Can we somehow take the kind of immersive theatrical qualities of this production where people could navigate an environment on their own and combine them with this set of digital assets that we created? I was also interested in, kind of from a more thematic perspective, how can we use emerging technology to give people this sort of Proustian experience of an object? This is a passage that I adore from Proust's Remembrance of Things Past. Some people may know it. It's the Madeleine cookie passage, where Proust bites into a Madeleine cookie, and the sensation of that object opens up this other space, right? In this case, it's sort of his whole childhood. This whole neighborhood begins to open up for him out of the sensation of this cookie dipped in tea, right? And I was sort of going through from sort of a personal standpoint. I was interested in that as well because I lost my parents over the course of that year, and I was sifting through my own basement, and I kept having this experience with objects of picking up an object that to someone else would look like nothing, right? But to you becomes this window into a particular time, a place, a space. So how could we use immersive technology to do that? And it felt like the object lesson was the right container for it. And so that started off with just kind of a simple prototyping where we built some basic object recognition technology, tried it out on tablets to launch immersive video. And then it built out into this full installation that launched at Tribeca Storyscapes 2018. So what you'll see is the set has some resemblance to the original show, but then people were navigating this using antique stereoscopes. So here's sort of so this is a stereoscope from 1895. Literally, people were carrying around 19th century antiques. That thing, I think, alone costs probably $500. But it's retrofitted with AR technology that will recognize objects and images and then launch immersive video, 2D video, or audio based on it, right? So every object is associated with some set of assets. Some of them have storytelling components. Some of them are just like bits of nostalgia, internet detritus, things of that kind. Again, there's a fairly absurdist aesthetic. All of these things have sort of headsets that are built into them. And part of it was we wanted viewers so look, there's an absurdity, right, to putting on a headset. And we wanted that kind of absurdity to be part of the piece, right? We all know this is a ridiculous thing to do socially and to do in front of other people, and how do we make that part of the humor? The other thing that we were trying to figure out is, most of the pieces that you go to see have a kind of a slick technological texture to them, right? Particularly in these kinds of festival environments. And we wanted to do the opposite of that, right? Because the show had this kind of DIY aesthetic, reliant on outmoded technology, things that you'd find in your garage, right? Your stereo from the 70s, or an old record player, right? So how can we merge the kind of tactile nature of going through a basement with the kind of new technology elements of augmented reality? So this will tell you a little bit about the aesthetic of the piece. This is how we introduce people to it at the beginning. So leaning into the ridiculousness of headsets. So you sort of get the idea, and then this is what you would actually see if you were looking through the viewfinder, right? So. So this is more complicated than it looks. So what's happening here is a few different types of interactions, right? So in some cases, what's happening is you're just looking at like a two-dimensional object, it's recognizing it, and it's launching a video asset off of it, right? But in other cases, like with that car door, we're actually placing video into an architectural element in the environment, right? So, and this set is built out of garbage. So what we were doing was trying to launch video assets that would be placed very specifically in 3 dimensions based off of a set that was constructed out of fairly unstable elements, right, and fully calibrated. So this was actually an enormously complicated task. We prototyped this entire piece and built out the set at Newlink, where I've been working out of for the last few years. We fully built the set, brought in the molecule, which built the object recognition technology, fully calibrated it, broke it down, brought it over to Tribeca and rebuilt it in order to create this experience where you could have fully immersive video, right, where you can kind of lean into these the objects literally become portals into experiences or stories that are associated with that thing, and then pop back out of them into the rest of the environment. The other thing that I was interested in was, I think one of the things that doesn't work about experiencing these pieces in kind of a festival environment. If anyone, how many people have been to like Tribeca Storyscapes or Sundance New Frontiers, or right? So probably the biggest complaint that people have is like you're in there for 3 hours and you see like 2 things. You spend the bulk of your time like hanging out, waiting on a wait list, etc., right? Wondering what other people are doing inside of a headset. So the other point around this was to do the opposite of that, to create an open architecture art installation that people could experience with a headset, and we had plenty of them available. Or if nothing was available, you could experience the tactile components of it while waiting, right? And we were able to, I think something like 3,000 people rolled through Tribeca through Storyscapes over the course of 10 days. My guess would be that probably upwards of 80 to 90% of them were able to experience this installation, because it was the only thing really that you could go through without having to wait on a headset, et cetera, right? And that was very much by design, and you can see a little bit from what this actually looked like, right? So we were running very large numbers of people through this piece, and the piece lasts as long as you want, right? So this was filled with probably 80 different triggers. So you could spend 5 minutes in it, you could spend 45 minutes in it. We had 5-year-old children running through, we had 90-year-olds. So it was very much geared towards this kind of general accessibility. Here's a woman going through it with her child, wearing a welding helmet with an AR. That's a retrofitted wrestler's mask, etc. Okay. Actually, I'll pause there for a second. Are there any questions about that installation? It's a fairly unique build.
What was the ratio between like the triggered ones and the architecturally designed?
Yeah. So what we wanted to have happen was, because this was a self-directed piece,
Yeah.
which was a terrifying thing to do, with tech, which I think at that point, the AR tech was released maybe 2 months before. So it was like not even beta, it was alpha. So we were running people through the experience with technology that really had not been field tested at all, with things that needed to be precisely calibrated and placed in space, and were based on a set that was constructed out of found objects and antiques, some of which were literally pulled out of a dump in Philadelphia before being built as this installation. So what we wanted to have happen was that you were guaranteed to hit a couple of large triggers that would make you realize just what was going on and create this sense of infinite possibility. And then you could rely on people to explore the environment. So there were probably about, I think, 8 large architectural elements, like that car door. There's an immersive oil painting. There was a sort of a little travel closet where if you stepped through it, you were on a beach in Bali. So a bunch of large elements like that, and then close to 100 elements spread throughout the environment, book covers, mugs, etc., that would launch all manner of other things.
What were you using for the AR?
Yeah, so we used a platform called Vuforia, which some of you may be familiar with some special sauce. So it was pretty good for recognizing kind of flat imagery, right? But we also needed it to be able to handle sort of complex geometries, and also be able to place visual assets, not sort of just like up against these objects, but placed out several feet so they were landing correctly in space. So the baseline platform was Vuforia, and then the molecule sort of substantially modified it to get it to work for our experience. Yeah.
So, two-part question. How much Jeff's feedback or input did you have for this extension of the original work? And
Yeah.
then from a creative frame, did you approach it as a sequel or extended universe or errata, or how?
Do you know Jeff's work?
Some of it.
Yeah. So yeah, Jeff was one of the lead creators on the piece. He was heavily involved in it. So the really kind of the biggest tension was the object lesson is in many ways sort of anti-technological, right? Because it's so much based on outmoded things. And so one of the biggest kind of issues that we were navigating was how can we introduce new emerging technology in a way that still feels organic to the DNA of the show, right? And this notion of sort of, kind of hiding it or pointing at it with a sense of humor, embracing the ways in which it is not fully functional, was a big part of it, right? Not pretending. I think a lot of times the thing that turns people off from an audience experience perspective about emerging technology is when emerging technologies are sort of pretending to be, kind of more baked than they are at a point in time, right? Where, and we all know this experience, right? You go in and you like do a demo and like doesn't quite work the way that it's supposed to work. And if the piece takes itself too seriously, it's jarring or alienating, right? Versus if you give audiences the space to have a sense of humor about the experience and about the ways in which the tech is imperfect, and technology is always imperfect, you kind of let them in on the joke. And even if the thing doesn't work perfectly, they don't care, right? Because they feel like they're on the same page with you. So that kind of, I would say, like, that was a huge conversation that we had with Jeff and the Object Lesson team around how can we integrate emerging technology with the show in a way that isn't going to feel like it, sort of betrays the principles of the thing. Does that kind of answer it?
Fantastic.
I'm just
Yeah.
curious, in terms of the audience feedback that you got about this being self-directed with essentially the one interlace in terms of the subject matter being the object itself, and that exploration, what kind of feedback did you get regarding this immersive experience?
Yeah, it's, generally very positive. We had, some of the best moments were, some of the best audience members were like children, actually, which I wasn't expecting, because they would just run in and begin exploring, what this piece of technology could do in relationship to everything in the room. I think sort of the biggest audience experience issues that we ran into was this sort of necessity of people kind of discovering that something would trigger quickly, right? If that doesn't happen in the first 30 to 60 seconds, they're out, right? And so we knew that going in, and it was designed very much that you would like hit something within the first few feet, realize what was happening, and then begin to explore on your own. We actually did this piece twice. Once at Tribeca, and then it transferred back to New York Theater Workshop. And that was sort of the frame around the piece was completely different when we did it there, because people bought like slots for about an hour. Whereas at Tribeca, you have no idea how long people are going to be in the experience, and you need to be a little bit more tech forward and directive, right? So it's like, here's a headset, go. But you could easily see other people who were already having an experience. When people were doing this at New York Theater Workshop, they would enter all at the same time at the beginning of an hour. And we actually didn't immediately present them with headsets. They started to just wander through the environment, pick through boxes, find things, and then eventually they would discover a headset. We also had plainclothes people who were part of the ground crew, just kind of looked like other members of the audience, and they would kind of model behavior where, they'd sort of, pick something up and then be like, oh, what's this thing, right? And if you see other people doing these behaviors, you start to pick up on them, and the headsets also make sound and things like that. But the idea was there are ways to be non-directive about how you should experience this, but still give people kind of directional indicators, and that worked very well.
Was there an audio component to this experience?
Yeah. All of those pieces have audio as well. There was also there were also sound elements that were built into the environment. Cool. So next was this piece that I was mentioning, the interpretation of dreams, which was thanks for coming. Was this so this was an experiment in doing serialized narrative. So after Lincoln and the Bardo, Samsung approached me and said, we're funding a VR pilot season. Are you interested in doing something that involves episodic narrative? And I've been interested in quite a while in how virtual reality might be used to represent dreams. There's this sort of fascinating history to the way that dreams and film and the language of cinema have interacted with each other, right? It goes back through, even really through Méliès, Fellini, Tarkovsky, Christopher Nolan, right? And it exists both at the level of film representing dreams, but also the language of dreams being used as a basis for defining a language for cinema, right? So people talk about Tarkovsky's films as being oniric, is the term that's used around this. It has this sort of weird, free-floating, dreamlike quality. It's kind of hard to locate who you are as a viewer. You're kind of floating through shots. And my interest was in how VR might be an even more potent medium in terms of intersection with dreaming than traditional 2D format filmmaking, right? Because we don't dream in frames, we dream immersively. And so when I was thinking about material that I could work with for that, I figured you go back to the source, Freud's interpretation of dreams from 1900. And then this intersected as well with this question around how do you tell a serialized story. In part, you don't know with a virtual reality audience at this point if they're going to come back for successive episodes. So I wanted things that would be self-contained but still have like a thematic through line. You don't know if people are going to watch things in order either, right? It's kind of a sort of a big assumption. So what I landed on doing was creating a 4-episode series where each episode was based on a different Freud case study. The Rat Man, Anna O, Dora, and then Freud's own dreams from the Interpretation of Dreams. So the Interpretation of Dreams was published in 1900, and it's sort of, Freud thought of it as his own magnum opus. At that point, he was afraid of revealing personal information about his patients, so he analyzed primarily his own dreams. And then over the next decade, you get these iconic case studies where Freud began applying that method to other people's dreams and publishing the cases. And so each of those cases became the basis for a single kind of immersive dreamscape that had a narrative through line. So I'll show you, here's the...
Explorers of a heroic and forgotten age. I've outdone them all. Planted my feet on a new continent, an inner continent. Worlds within worlds that have yet to be mapped, waiting for a discoverer. I am he. Dreams are the detour by which repression can be evaded. The royal road to the unconscious.
So this will show you a little bit about the sort of behind the scenes and what it looked like making this. So that's a Sony Z-Cam. So a lot of the challenge with working on this project, one was this was adapting material that is not inherently narrative. Right, so if you go back and you read these case studies, a lot of them are highly open-ended. In addition, they, Freud's approach was linguistic. It was not inherently visual, right? And so in virtual reality, and sort of the landscape of dreaming is principally visual and auditory, right? So how do you take this sort of associative language of the case studies and translate it into a visual medium? And a lot of the way that wound up happening was sort of through the handling of art direction. And the idea was to sort of produce these series of kind of evocative, heavily art-directed environments that would feel kind of sufficiently rich, also on a relatively limited budget. The way that we did that was to take over a series of abandoned spaces that we knew we could kind of art direct however we wanted. This was actually shot in rural West Virginia. And this is a bit of an homage shot to Kubrick's Barry Lyndon, which is lit right entirely by candlelight. And so that was sort of the general approach to these pieces. So this came out at the pilot episode came out at the Tribeca came out during the Tribeca Film Festival through Samsung, and then all 4 episodes launched at the Vancouver Film Festival in October, and this has now been fully released through Samsung. And then kind of the last big project that I'll talk about is this piece, Hamlet, Thy Father's Spirit, which just came out, I think, about 2 months ago through Google and WGBH. So this piece was a collaboration with a theater company that's actually based here in Boston. Some people may know Commonwealth Shakespeare Company. They're guys who do Shakespeare on Boston Common every year. I actually first met them as an undergrad up the road at that other Cambridge school where I went as an undergraduate, and I like interned with this theater company 15 years ago, and it's probably more than 15 years ago. And I had this sort of running interest, as you've seen, around how do theater and new media interact with each other. And the artistic director of the company approached me and said, "Hey, I'm at the very beginning of conversations with Google around some type of Shakespeare adaptation. I don't really know kind of the rules of the medium. Is there some way that we can kind of intersect these two things?" And what that grew into was an experiment in doing something that was closer to feature length. So this piece is an hour long, which I don't think is literally the longest VR piece I've ever heard of. I think I've heard Jesus VR is 2.5 hours, something like that. But substantially longer than the majority of pieces, right? So it was also an experiment in kind of audience attention. It's very, very long for a VR piece, but it's very short for Hamlet, right? Hamlet, the typical theatrical production will be like 3 hours long, right? So one major question was like condensing this play down and what that means. And the other was, as with something like the object lesson, what perspective can you put viewers in that is organic to the material but impossible theatrically? And the idea with this was, we'll put you in the perspective of Hamlet's father's ghost. So that gives you a role within. What I really wanted to avoid was this feeling, which I've seen in other pieces that have a kind of connection to theater, that a camera has sort of been placed in the middle of a theatrical production, right? The avoidance of this sort of Swayze effect. So you as a viewer put in the perspective of Hamlet's father's ghost. It justifies, these sort of typically awkward moments in the theatrical staging of the show where you have Hamlet speaking to his father's ghost and it's a light bulb or a character off stage or whatever. But two, it also provides a kind of mechanism for justifying a sort of voyeurism for you as a viewer. And then the other element of it was how can we design this scenically in a way that's going to feel visually active at all times. So the set designer on this is a totally brilliant. His name is Clint Ramos. He's won several Tony Awards. over the last few years. So what we converged on for the design of this was something modeled kind of loosely almost on like Dogville by Lars von Trier, if people know Dogville. Dogville is done in this kind of Brechtian style where I think it was shot in like a giant airplane hangar, where you can see an entire town at all times. The houses are kind of built out of evocative elements, but are semi-transparent. So there'll be a narrative focus, but you can see all aspects of this village at all times. Right? So the idea behind the set design for this was, okay, if we're going to put you into sections of the play, but we want to keep things active visually from a 360 staging perspective, we can in a sense construct a set that has all parts already active, which also linked to this idea that you are Hamlet's father's ghost, and the whole thing is sort of transpiring in a kind of afterlife. So you're watching the boudoir scene, but the cemetery scene is already partially underway. The set designer brought in 20 tons of dirt and built a full cemetery. We had a fully functioning automobile. Ophelia drowns herself in a 40,000 gallon tank of water. So we had this kind of enormous activated set that provided these background elements alongside all of the narrative scenes. And I'll just show you a little bit from that piece.
Too good. But break my heart, for I must hold my tongue. This is a great defense. Thou spirit of hell, or goblin damned, bring with the airs from heaven or blasts from hell. Thou comest in such a questionable shape that I will speak to thee. I'll call thee Hamlet. King, father, royal dane, oh answer me.
Mark me!
Speak, I am bound to hear.
So art thou to revenge, when thou shalt hear.
What?
I am thy father's spirit, doomed for a certain term to walk the night, and for the day confined to fast in fires till the foul crimes done in my days of nature are burnt and purged away. But that I am forbid to tell the secrets of my prison house, I could a tale unfold whose lightest word would harrow up thy soul, freeze thy young blood, make thy two eyes like stars start from their spheres. But this eternal blazon must not be to ears of flesh and blood.
Oh, I'll pause there. That's obviously the moment where the ghost reveals himself to Hamlet, and you sort of hear your own voice. How are we doing on time? We're right about at 1 hour and 15. So I will pause there and I guess open up for questions. Yeah.
Is there a way to experience your, like a version of the 360 installation that's not going to where you have it in New York? Like, is there a version of it that exists in 360?
The objects installation?
Yes.
That's the challenge with multisensory installations. Yeah. So we have invitations to do the piece again. And other than that, like I have material that you could experience, but the installation is currently in a large storage container in Philadelphia, but probably will be remounted.
So have you considered maybe 3D scanning everything and then, you know, placing the videos inside of the select markers and then recreating it entirely in VR?
One could do something like that. The question would be, how does that interact with the spirit of the piece? So my instinct would be that would run counter to the spirit of the piece. The spirit of the piece is about the way that a tactile experience interacts with a digital experience. And I think if we took away that tactile component of it, it would sort of be something else entirely. It could be done, but it's very much about being in a physical space with things, and the way that digital things interact with physical things. And I don't. We could do it, but I don't think that it would sort of play well with the essence of what we're trying to do. But, it's a worthy idea. I don't know that this particular piece would lend itself well to doing.
So are you okay with the ephemerality of it? The fact that like it can only be experienced by a select amount of people this way?
I mean, what you're hitting on is a huge issue around multisensory installation, right? That also applies, frankly, to theater. The essence of theater is that it's a extremely present but temporary experience. And even actually this show and the installation in turn, when it's remounted, some of the objects will survive from one instantiation to another, but a lot of them are like sourced again based on the place where, we had an invitation to do this in kind of a francophone geography, and we were going to collect an entirely new set of objects based on that place so that it would feel resonant with the particular audience in that location. And so I think that there's a kind of a significant link there between place, audience, presence, and ephemerality that is part of the DNA of this particular installation. Not of every installation, but of this particular installation.
I just feel like it seems very interesting as far as other things I've seen people do, like with AR storytelling. It seems like a lot more people should be able to experience it than just the people who are at Tribeca or the people who are able to make it in New York.
I totally agree with that. But I think the way to experience it will be in remounting it physically. Yes.
So you said you have used 80 different objects as part of this installation. So I would imagine an individual would not go for every 80 objects. Have
Correct.
you found any patterns in what people were typically drawn to? Do you think there's any science behind that?
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. Is there a science behind it? I think what was fascinating was the difference between. So when this was presented at Tribeca, people are coming in with a certain prior. The prior that they're coming in with is that this experience involves emerging technology. And so people are hunting for that. If they hit it quickly, it confirms that expectation. If they don't hit it quickly, it does not confirm and they're out. And so we push those elements sort of forward knowing that. When we did this in a theatrical context, we had a completely different audience. We had an audience that did not have a tech prior, right? They had if anything, there's a sort of people who were into downtown experimental theater often don't care that much about technology, right? And so with that, people were in a sense much more forgiving about when and the degree to which they encounter tech. Was this sort of bizarre surprise, right? You begin to explore an environment that has a kind of sensory component to it, and then as you stumble upon the technology, you realize that there's this other layer to the experience. So that's not. There's nothing scientific about that statement, but I think that notion of like, even with the same piece, building it differently based on an understanding of what the audience is prior is going to be walking into it, right? Because if you ignore that, you know, I think if we had done the equivalent of the theatrical production of this at Tribeca, we would have lost people within a minute, because that audience is expecting a certain kind of technological experience, and also it's an open installation where like you can be in or out very quickly. You know, but anyway, within that, I would say that, yeah, we tended to bifurcate audiences. We had people who were like into exploration, and people who were like, I would like to be served up a thing, and this is not automatically doing that, right? I think probably 90% of audience members were excited about that kind of exploration, but that's not everybody. So.